The towering gates of Grey Manor opened to a world of opulence, where every detail spoke of wealth and power. Inside, Alexander Grey moved with the practiced ease of someone who had known privilege all his life. Yet, beneath the polished exterior lay a man who felt trapped by expectations he had never chosen. His days were a blur of high-stakes meetings and nights filled with shallow parties, leaving him hollow despite his extravagant lifestyle. Sophie Bennet, on the other hand, was the quiet backbone of Grey Manor. She had been hired 2 years ago as a housekeeper and had since become an invisible force that ensured the house ran seamlessly. Sophie's life was a stark contrast to Alexander's. Having grown up in modest circumstances, she valued hard work and integrity above all. Her dedication to her job wasn't just about earning a living. It was her way of finding dignity in a world that often looked past her. Their paths had crossed many times before, but only in the briefest of moments. Alexander barely noticing the quiet figure arranging fresh flowers in the dining hall, Sophie stepping aside as he swept through the halls. He was the untouchable heir, and she was one of the many staff ensuring his life remained flawless. That changed one crisp autumn morning. Sophie was descending the grand staircase, balancing a tray of delicate china, when Alexander, distracted by his phone, turned the corner sharply. The near collision sent a gasp rippling through the air. Sophie steadied herself just in time, the china rattling precariously but remaining intact. "Watch where you're," Alexander began sharply, his tone born of habit. But when his eyes met hers, something made him pause. "I'm so sorry, sir," Sophie said quickly, stepping back to give him space. Her cheeks flushed, but her voice remained steady. Alexander frowned, his gaze lingering on her face. There was something striking about her, not in the way he was accustomed to noticing beauty, but in the quiet strength she exuded. She didn't cower or avert her eyes like most people in her position did. "No, I wasn't paying attention," he admitted, surprising himself with the uncharacteristic apology. Sophie offered a polite nod before continuing down the stairs, but Alexander found himself turning to watch her retreating figure. He dismissed the moment, chalking it up to a fleeting curiosity, and went about his day. But that brief encounter set off a chain of events. Over the following weeks, Alexander began noticing Sophie in ways he hadn't before. Her calm efficiency, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, and the way she seemed untouched by the grandeur surrounding her. One evening, as Alexander walked through the sprawling gardens, he spotted Sophie sitting on a bench during her break, a book in her hands. The sight of her, so engrossed and serene, piqued his interest. Without thinking, he approached. "What are you reading?" he asked casually, startling her. Sophie looked up, her surprise quickly masked by politeness. "Just a novel, sir." "Alexander," he corrected. "Call me Alexander." She hesitated. "Of course, Alexander." That night marked the beginning of their conversations. At first, they were brief and formal, but as the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself seeking her out. They talked about everything except the glaring disparity in their positions, books, the changing seasons, even the quirks of the mansion's ancient architecture. Sophie's insights were refreshingly candid, and her grounded perspective challenged Alexander in ways few had dared. For Sophie, these exchanges were both thrilling and unsettling. She couldn't deny her growing fondness for Alexander, but she reminded herself of the gulf between their lives. Alexander was the heir to an empire, while she was simply a housekeeper. Unbeknownst to both, the seeds of something profound were being sown, a connection that defied their worlds and hinted at a story yet to unfold. The growing bond between Alexander and Sophie became an unspoken secret within the walls of Grey Manor. Their conversations, once confined to brief, chance encounters, gradually expanded into stolen moments that carried an unmistakable depth. Whether it was a quiet chat in the garden or a fleeting exchange in the library, their connection deepened with each passing day. Yet, in the grand halls of Grey Manor, whispers began to circulate. The staff, though careful not to overstep, couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts. Alexander, who had always been aloof, seemed unusually grounded. His mood lightened, his temper softened, and he often appeared lost in thought. Meanwhile, Sophie's presence, once invisible, now drew attention, not by her actions, but by the heir's growing interest in her. For Alexander, Sophie was a revelation. In her, he found a refuge from the suffocating expectations of his world. She was unpretentious, her insights sharp yet compassionate, and her laughter genuine. In contrast to the fleeting, shallow relationships he had known, his time with Sophie felt real. It was as though she saw him, not Alexander Gray, the heir, but Alexander, the man. Sophie, however, wrestled with conflicting emotions. She cherished the moments they shared but knew how precarious her position was. The line between them was as clear as the polished marble floors she walked every day. She reminded herself constantly that Alexander belonged to a world that would never accept someone like her. One evening, after most of the household had retired, Alexander found Sophie in the library. She was organizing the books, her hands delicately tracing the spines. "You're always working," he remarked, stepping inside. Sophie looked up, startled. "I didn't realize anyone was still awake," she said, her voice steady despite her surprise. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning against the doorway. "This house feels quieter than usual at night." Sophie smiled faintly. "It's always quiet, sir. I mean, Alexander." He chuckled softly and crossed the room to stand beside her. "You're different, Sophie," he said after a moment. Her brow furrowed. "Different?" "Yes," he said, searching for the right words. "You're real. You don't put on airs, and you don't tell me what I want to hear. I need that." Sophie lowered her gaze, her heart pounding. "I'm just a housekeeper, Alexander. That's all I am." "You're more than that," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You see the world differently, and it's made me start questioning my own." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Sophie's instinct was to retreat, to remind him of the boundaries they could never cross. But the look in his eyes, vulnerable and sincere, made her hesitate. As the weeks passed, their stolen moments grew longer. One rainy afternoon, Alexander insisted she take a break from her duties and join him in the sunroom. They sat by the large glass windows, watching raindrops race down the panes. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" he asked suddenly. Sophie hesitated. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I have responsibilities. I can't just leave." "You deserve more than this," Alexander said, his tone filled with conviction. "And what about you?" she countered. "Do you think about leaving?" Alexander laughed bitterly. "All the time. But leaving isn't so simple when you're bound by expectations and a name that's bigger than you." Sophie regarded him carefully. For all his wealth and power, Alexander seemed burdened, as though the privileges of his life came at a cost. Their conversations grew more personal, revealing vulnerabilities that neither had shared with anyone else. But with this deepening connection came an unspoken tension. They both knew their bond was unconventional, even dangerous. Alexander's family would never approve, and Sophie's position as a housekeeper left her vulnerable to scrutiny. One evening, Alexander invited Sophie to join him for a late-night walk in the gardens. The air was cool, the moonlight casting a soft glow on the carefully manicured hedges. As they strolled side by side, their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on dreams, regrets, and the weight of expectations. At one point, Alexander paused, turning to face her. "Sophie, I don't know what this is, but it feels important," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "It's not simple, Alexander. It never will be." "I don't care about simple," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I care about what's real, and this, what we have, it feels real to me." Sophie looked away, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the sincerity of his words, but the practical side of her knew better. Their worlds were too different, the risks too great. "Alexander," she said softly, her voice tinged with both longing and resignation, "we can't ignore who we are. You're the heir to Gray Enterprises, and You're Sophie," he interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "That's all that matters to me." For a brief moment, Sophie allowed herself to imagine a world where his words could be true, a world where their connection wouldn't be forbidden. But as the night wore on, reality began to settle once more. Though their bond was undeniable, they both knew that their growing feelings would only invite complications. Yet, neither could bring themselves to pull away. Their connection had become a quiet rebellion against the lives they had been destined to lead, and for now, that was enough. The days at Gray Manor passed in a haze of routines and responsibilities, but for Sophie, each moment seemed to carry a new weight. Her stolen moments with Alexander had shifted something fundamental in her life. The connection they shared, though unspoken and undefined, was like a fragile thread pulling them closer. Yet, Sophie couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered. As winter set in, the mansion became a cocoon of warmth and light against the cold outside. The staff busied themselves preparing for the upcoming gala, a signature event where the Gray family showcased their wealth and influence. Sophie found herself working longer hours, her interactions with Alexander reduced to fleeting glances and brief exchanges. It was during one of these late nights, as Sophie tidied the empty dining hall, that she first felt the dizzying wave of nausea. Brushing it off as fatigue, she continued with her duties, unwilling to let anything distract her. But as the days turned into weeks, the symptoms grew harder to ignore. Persistent exhaustion, queasiness, and an overwhelming sense that something was different. One afternoon, Sophie slipped away to the nearby clinic on her day off, her heart heavy with apprehension. The waiting room felt stifling, every minute stretching endlessly. When the doctor finally confirmed her suspicions, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "You're about 8 weeks along," the doctor said with a kind smile. Sophie left the clinic in a daze, clutching the ultrasound photo tightly in her hand. The realization that she was carrying Alexander's child filled her with a whirlwind of emotions. Joy, fear, and uncertainty all mingling in a storm she couldn't contain. She knew this wasn't a situation she could ignore. For days, Sophie debated her next steps. She considered keeping the news to herself, but deep down, she knew Alexander had a right to know. Despite their different worlds, despite the complications their relationship had already brought, she couldn't make this decision alone. Late one evening, after most of the household had gone to bed, Sophie sought out Alexander. She found him in the study, his brow furrowed as he pored over documents. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening at the sight of her. "Sophie," he said, setting the papers aside. "What's wrong?" Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her coat. "Alexander, I need to tell you something. It's important." He straightened, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "Go on." Taking a deep breath, Sophie met his gaze. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Alexander's expression shifted, shock and disbelief flickering across his face. "Pregnant?" he echoed, as if testing the word on his tongue. She nodded, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's yours, Alexander." For a moment, he said nothing, his silence louder than any response. Sophie felt her chest tighten, the weight of his reaction pressing down on her. How could this happen?" he finally said, his tone defensive. Sophie's eyes narrowed. "You know how it happened, Alexander. This isn't just my responsibility, it's ours." He ran a hand through his hair, standing abruptly. "Do you have any idea what this means? For my family, for my reputation?" "Reputation?" Sophie interrupted, her voice rising. "That's what you're worried about?" Her words cut through the tension, and Alexander froze. The hurt in her eyes was unmistakable, and it pierced through his defensiveness. "Sophie, I didn't mean—" "No," she said firmly, stepping back. "I thought you deserved to know, but I can see now that you're more concerned about appearances than anything else." "Sophie, wait," he said, his tone softer now, but she was already turning away. She left the study, her heart aching with a mix of anger and disappointment. For days, she avoided Alexander, throwing herself into her work while trying to come to terms with the reality of her situation. Finally, unable to endure the weight of staying in a place where she felt both invisible and exposed, Sophie made a decision. She packed her belongings and handed in her resignation, leaving a short note for Alexander that said only, "I'll take care of this on my own. Goodbye." Sophie moved into a modest apartment in the city, determined to build a life for herself and her child. She took a part-time job at a local cafe while preparing for the baby's arrival. Though the days were long and the challenges numerous, she found strength in her resolve. Months later, on a rainy spring morning, Sophie welcomed her son into the world. She named him Matthew, a tribute to her late father who had always taught her to persevere. As she held him in her arms for the first time, the uncertainty of her future faded, replaced by an unshakable sense of purpose. Back at Grey Manor, Alexander struggled with Sophie's departure. Her absence left a void he hadn't anticipated, and the guilt over his reaction to her news gnawed at him. He buried himself in work, but no amount of meetings or deals could fill the emptiness. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, he stumbled upon a local feature about a new cafe that had become a hub for its community. The article's accompanying photo stopped him cold. Sophie stood behind the counter, her smile radiant, and in her arms was a baby boy with unmistakable gray features. In that moment, Alexander knew he couldn't stay away. Life in the city was far from easy for Sophie, but it was hers to build. After leaving Grey Manor, she poured all her energy into making a life for her son, Matthew. Her small apartment was modest but cozy, with sunlight streaming through the windows in the morning and the sound of the city humming outside. Every detail she added, from the cheerful curtains to the second-hand rocking chair, was for Matthew. Starting over mint sacrifices, Sophie took on shifts at a local cafe, working tirelessly to save every penny. She soon realized her passion for baking and cooking could be more than just a skill. It could be the foundation of a new dream. With the help of a small business loan and a landlord who believed in her determination, Sophie opened her own cafe in Queens, naming it Little Haven. The cafe became a haven not just for Sophie, but for the neighborhood. Her warm personality and homemade recipes drew in locals who quickly became regulars. From children savoring her freshly baked cookies to elderly couples sharing quiet conversations over coffee, Little Haven was a place where everyone felt welcome. Meanwhile, Matthew was the center of Sophie's world. Though still a baby, he filled her days with purpose and joy. His first giggles and the way he clung to her finger reminded Sophie why she had chosen to walk away from Grey Manor. Every challenge she faced, balancing bills, late-night feedings, and the demands of running a cafe, was worth it when she looked into his bright eyes. But while Sophie found purpose in her new life, Alexander's world was unraveling. Back at Grey Enterprises, cracks began to show in the empire he had once taken for granted. A series of bad investments, internal conflicts, and growing competition began to erode the company's dominance. Alexander found himself buried under pressure from shareholders and his family, who expected him to uphold their legacy. More troubling than the business issues, however, was the emptiness he couldn't ignore. Sophie's departure had left a void in his life that no amount of work or distraction could fill. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him that night in the study, hurt, disappointed, and resolute. Her words echoed in his mind, "I'll take care of this on my own." Alexander tried to move on, but even his social circle, once a source of fleeting entertainment, felt hollow. The parties, the acquaintances, and the endless string of meaningless conversations left him feeling more isolated than ever. It was during one of these restless nights that he stumbled upon the article about Sophie's cafe. At first, he didn't believe it. Seeing her name in print, alongside a glowing review of Little Haven, felt surreal. But then he saw the photo, the familiar smile, the determination in her eyes, and the baby in her arms. Matthew. Alexander couldn't deny it. The child in Sophie's arms had his features, the same intense gaze, the same stubborn chin. His chest tightened as he stared at the image, 1,000 emotions surging through him. He sat back in his chair, grappling with the weight of what he had just seen. Sophie had rebuilt her life, and she had done it without him. She had created something beautiful and meaningful, while he had allowed himself to be consumed by his fears and obligations. That night, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't let things remain as they were. Sophie had been right to leave, but he wasn't willing to let her go without making things right, not for himself, but for the child who deserved to know his father. A week later, Sophie was cleaning up after the morning rush when the cafe door chimed. She glanced up, expecting another regular, but froze when she saw who stood there. Alexander. Dressed in a tailored coat and holding a tentative expression, he seemed out of place in the cozy cafe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie's heart raced as 1,000 thoughts ran through her mind. "What are you doing here?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "I needed to see you," Alexander said, stepping forward. "I read about the cafe. I wanted to see it for myself." Sophie crossed her arms. "Well, you've seen it. You can go now." "Sophie," he said softly, his tone earnest, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to talk to you." She hesitated, glancing around the cafe. The last thing she wanted was a scene. With a sigh, she gestured toward an empty table in the corner. "5 minutes," she said, leading him over. Alexander sat, his gaze never leaving her. "I saw the article," he began. "You've done something incredible here. This place, it's amazing." Sophie raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Is that why you're here? To compliment my cafe?" "No," he admitted, leaning forward. "I'm here because of Matthew. I know he's mine, Sophie. I can see it in his eyes." Her expression hardened. "And what does that mean to you, Alexander? Do you want to play the hero now? Show up and pretend everything's fine?" "I don't want to pretend," he said firmly. "I made mistakes, Sophie. I was scared, and I reacted poorly. But I want to fix things. I want to know him, to be part of his life, if you'll let me." Sophie studied him, her heart conflicted. She had spent months building a life without Alexander, convincing herself that she didn't need him. But now, here he was, looking at her with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "I don't trust you," she said finally. "Not yet. Matthew deserves stability, and I won't let you disrupt that." "I understand," Alexander said, his voice steady, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove to you, and to him, that I can be the father he deserves." As he left the cafe, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander's return would change everything. Whether it would be for better or worse, she couldn't yet say. But one thing was certain. Their lives were about to intertwine once again. The following days were filled with uncertainty for Sophie. Alexander's visit to her cafe had thrown her into turmoil, and despite her best efforts to stay focused on Matthew and her growing business, his words lingered in her mind. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his eyes when he spoke about wanting to be part of Matthew's life. And yet, the scars from the past were still fresh, the pain of his initial rejection still raw. Could she truly trust him again? Despite her inner conflict, Sophie knew that her life, and Matthew's, was about to change. Alexander had made it clear he wasn't going to give up easily, and Sophie, for all her reservations, couldn't help but wonder if his commitment was genuine this time. It wasn't long before Alexander showed up again. This time, he was standing at the door of Little Haven, the same hesitance in his steps as before, but with something more, determination. Sophie watched him from behind the counter, her heart pounding. When he entered, he didn't speak immediately, instead taking in the warm, cozy atmosphere of the cafe. The familiar hum of conversations, the clink of coffee cups, and the soft scent of fresh pastries all seemed to ground him. He turned to Sophie, his expression softer than it had been the first time he'd come. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said," Alexander began, his voice measured. "I know I can't undo the past. I can't erase the mistakes I made." Sophie crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Then why are you here, Alexander? You said your piece last time. I don't need any more empty promises." "I'm not here to make promises," he said quietly, taking a step closer. "I'm here because I want to show you that I'm serious. I want to be there for Matthew. Not because of obligation, but because I want to be a father to him. And I want to build a relationship with you, one that's built on trust." Sophie's heart fluttered painfully in her chest. She had to admit, his words were different this time. The man standing in front of her wasn't the arrogant heir she had known, but someone who seemed to have been humbled by his own mistakes. "I don't know if I can believe that," she said, her voice low. "You walked away once. What's different now?" Alexander paused, his gaze searching hers. "What's different now is that I've realized I've been running from everything that matters. I've built my whole life on things that don't fulfill me. Wealth, power, expectations. But that's not what I want anymore. I want to be a part of Matthew's life, and I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. His words, though still raw and uncertain, carried the weight of someone who was finally taking responsibility. She looked down at the counter, the warmth of the cafe suddenly feeling like a barrier between them. I can't just forget everything, Alexander, she said, her voice breaking slightly. It's not that simple. I've spent so long protecting Matthew from everything we both left behind. I can't risk it all again. He nodded slowly, understanding the depth of her fear. I know it's not simple. I know it will take time, and I'm willing to earn your trust. I want to prove to you that I'm here for you both. No games. No pretending. Just honesty. Sophie's eyes welled with tears as the weight of the situation settled over her. She had worked so hard to create a life where she and Matthew were safe from the past, and now Alexander was back, threatening to upend everything she had built. Yet, as much as she resisted, she couldn't deny the pull between them. A part of her still wanted him in her life, despite the hurt he had caused. Okay, she said finally, her voice a whisper, but you have to understand that it's not just about you anymore. It's about Matthew. And if you hurt him again, her words trailed off, but the warning in her gaze was clear. I understand, Alexander said quietly, his voice sincere. And I'll do everything I can to make sure I never hurt either of you again. For a long moment, Sophie simply watched him, her mind spinning with the possibilities and the risks. It wasn't easy to open the door again, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in Alexander's eyes. A hope that perhaps, together, they could build something new. The following weeks saw a gradual shift in the dynamics between Sophie and Alexander. He kept his word, showing up at the cafe regularly, not as a wealthy businessman seeking to assert his dominance, but as a father trying to reconnect with his son. He began helping Sophie with the cafe's operations, taking on menial tasks that no one else would have expected him to do. He swept floors, carried boxes, and even took over the register when Sophie was overwhelmed with customers. It was in these quiet moments that Sophie saw the changes in him. Alexander was no longer the aloof, distant man who had dismissed her and their son so easily. He was present, engaged, and willing to be vulnerable in ways she hadn't thought possible. He shared stories of his own childhood, of the loneliness he'd felt growing up in a family that valued image over connection. For Matthew, things were different too. The first time Alexander spent time with him, it was over a simple puzzle. Matthew, being a curious and bright child, was wary at first, but Alexander's patience paid off. Slowly, Matthew began to open up, sharing his favorite toys and asking Alexander questions about his work. Sophie watched from the kitchen, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to see Alexander truly try to bond with her son. But as much as Alexander was changing, his family was still a looming presence. The pressure from his parents, especially his father, was growing. Gray Enterprises was in trouble, and his father's expectations for Alexander to take control were relentless. But as Alexander spent more time with Sophie and Matthew, he began to realize something important. He didn't want to inherit the same empty life his parents had. He wanted to build something that mattered, something real. One evening, as they sat in the cafe after closing, Sophie turned to him, a question in her eyes. Are you ready to let go of that world? She asked quietly. The one that demands everything from you, except your heart. Alexander didn't hesitate. Yes, he said firmly. For the first time, I'm ready to choose something different. I want this us, and I want to be a father to Matthew. I'm done with the life I was expected to lead. Sophie smiled, a mix of relief and uncertainty still lingering in her heart. But for the first time in a long time, she believed him. They were starting over, not just for Matthew, but for themselves. And this time, it would be different. The days that followed felt like a fragile truce, tentative, yet filled with the hope of something new. Sophie's life, once carefully structured around the rhythms of Little Haven and her small apartment, began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every time Alexander showed up at the cafe, offering to help or bringing Matthew small gifts, Sophie's walls, which she had so carefully constructed, seemed to crack ever so slightly. It wasn't that she had fully forgiven him or forgotten the hurt he had caused. That would take time. But his presence, the quiet and consistent way he proved he was there for her, was a steady reminder that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Sophie knew the real test would be how long Alexander could maintain this newfound resolve. She'd seen the world he came from, the world that had shaped him into the man he once was. But she also saw the man who, despite all his flaws, wanted to build something more than just a business empire. He wanted a family. But there were still obstacles, most notably, his family's looming expectations and the pressure to salvage Gray enterprises. Sophie was under no illusion about the power his family wielded. She knew that even if Alexander wanted a different life, breaking free from their grasp would be far from easy. One evening, as the cafe emptied after closing, Sophie sat across from Alexander, a cup of coffee between them. The tension in the air was palpable, as if they were both waiting for something important to be said. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sophie began, her voice steady, "about choosing something real. But the truth is, Alexander, choosing us isn't just about you walking away from your family. It's about you standing up to them. And I don't know if you're ready for that." Alexander's eyes darkened slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "You're right. I can't pretend like it's going to be easy. My family's expectations are overwhelming, and they're not going to let me walk away without a fight." Sophie sighed, her heart heavy. "It's not just about your family, though, is it? It's about the life you've been living. You've spent so many years chasing things that were never truly yours to begin with. What happens when you're forced to choose between us and them?" The question hung in the air, unresolved. Alexander stared at her, his jaw tightening as he weighed her words. For the first time, Sophie saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But there was also something else, determination. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted, finally meeting her gaze. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I don't want to go back to the life I had. I can't go back to pretending that the power, the money, the status, they mean anything." Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. For the first time since their reunion, she truly believed he was making a choice. A choice to be something more than just the heir to an empire. A choice to be someone worthy of her trust. But the reality of their situation was unavoidable. Alexander's family wasn't going to give up on him easily. His father, especially, had spent years grooming him to take over the reins of Gray Enterprises, and the idea of Alexander abandoning the legacy he had built was unthinkable. "I've already made a decision," Alexander said suddenly, his voice firm. "I've decided to step away from Gray Enterprises." Sophie blinked, taken aback by the sudden declaration. "What do you mean, step away?" "I mean I'm leaving," he replied, his expression resolute. "I've spent my whole life living in their shadow, doing what they wanted. But it's not my life. It's theirs. I'm not going to continue down that path." Sophie couldn't help the surge of emotions that rose within her. She had always known that Alexander's choices had been dictated by his family's power, but to hear him speak so decisively, so unapologetically, about stepping away from everything he knew was a revelation. "But what about your family? They'll never let you go that easily." Alexander's lips curled into a small, determined smile. "I know, but I've made my decision. I've already spoken to my father, and he didn't take it well. But this is my life. I don't want to be a part of something that doesn't bring me happiness." Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by a lingering anxiety. The road ahead was still uncertain, and they were only at the beginning of this new chapter. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sophie asked, her voice a mix of awe and concern. "Leaving everything behind. It's a huge step, Alexander." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I want this. I want you. I want Matthew. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to build a future with you." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her heart racing as the weight of his words settled over her. For so long, she had built her world around protecting Matthew, around keeping them safe from the past. And now, she was being asked to take another risk, to trust Alexander again, to believe that this time, he wouldn't let her down. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice filled with both hope and hesitation. But it won't be easy. We have a lot to overcome, Alexander. I know, he replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. But I'm willing to fight for it. For you. For Matthew. For us. In that moment, Sophie realized that this was just the beginning. There were still battles to be fought, both internal and external, but for the first time, she felt like they were on the same side. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the days passed, Alexander's commitment to Sophie and Matthew only deepened. He helped out more at the cafe, rolling up his sleeves and immersing himself in the day-to-day operations. He learned the names of the regulars, greeted customers with a genuine smile, and even started contributing ideas to improve the menu. The cafe became a place where he could truly belong, not as the heir to Gray Enterprises, but as someone who cared about the community Sophie had built. For Matthew, Alexander's presence was still a delicate thing. The child was hesitant at first, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. But Alexander, ever patient, never pushed. He simply showed up, day after day, earning Matthew's trust with quiet gestures, playing games with him, taking him on small outings, and always listening when Matthew spoke. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Alexander and Matthew sat together in the cafe, working on a puzzle. Matthew glanced up at him, his small voice filled with curiosity. "Do you like being here with us?" he asked innocently. Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I do. I like it more than I ever imagined." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I'm glad." In that simple exchange, Alexander realized something profound. He had found what he had been searching for all along. The life he had once thought he wanted, the empire, the wealth, the status, had never truly fulfilled him. It was here, in this small cafe with Sophie and Matthew, that he had found his purpose. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, they began to build a new life together. One that was far from perfect, but real and full of love. The days blended together, each one filled with a quiet but undeniable sense of change. Sophie and Alexander, despite the many challenges, were finding their rhythm, creating a life together built on trust and shared purpose. But the real test, the one that would solidify their transformation, came in an unexpected form: Matthew. Matthew had always been a quiet child, his brilliance hidden behind a veneer of shyness. Sophie had always known that her son was special, though his talents often went unnoticed by the world around him. But as the months passed, it became increasingly clear that Matthew wasn't just a brilliant child. He was a force to be reckoned with. It started with his curiosity. He would ask endless questions, devouring books on science, history, and art. He spent hours drawing intricate designs and solving complex puzzles that seemed impossible for a child his age. Sophie, ever the protector, had kept Matthew's talents close to her heart, unwilling to let the world see too much of what he could do. But one day, as the cafe bustled with its usual late-afternoon rush, a flyer landed on the counter, an announcement for a local academic competition. Sophie glanced at it, her heart skipping a beat. It was an event that would draw the best and brightest minds from around the city, and Matthew, with his quiet brilliance, would be a perfect fit. But she hesitated. The idea of putting him out there, of letting others see what he was capable of, filled her with a mix of pride and anxiety. Alexander, who had been watching her carefully, noticed her unease. "You should let him enter," he said softly, coming up beside her. Sophie met his gaze, uncertainty still clouding her thoughts. "I don't know. I don't want to push him. He's still so young." "But he's ready," Alexander said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "Matthew has something special in him. He deserves to have the chance to show the world what he can do. And you've been protecting him, Sophie, but sometimes protecting him means letting him take risks." Sophie felt her chest tighten. Alexander was right. Matthew had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. It was time for him to step into the light, to show the world what he was made of. With a deep breath, Sophie nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll sign him up." The days leading up to the competition were a whirlwind. Matthew poured himself into his preparation, studying late into the night with a quiet determination that both amazed and humbled Sophie. She watched him work, her heart swelling with pride and anxiety in equal measure. She knew how hard he was trying, and she feared that the pressure would be too much for him. But Matthew, it seemed, thrived under pressure. When the day of the competition arrived, Sophie could hardly contain her nerves. She stood at the edge of the room, watching as Matthew confidently took his place alongside the other contestants, his eyes focused and calm. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "He's ready," he said, his voice steady with quiet conviction. Sophie nodded, though her heart was racing. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment that would change everything, for both Matthew and for their family. The competition was fierce, filled with brilliant young minds who were all vying for the top prize. But Matthew, with his sharp mind and unshakable focus, quickly rose to the challenge. He answered every question with a quiet confidence, his hands steady as he solved puzzles that left the other competitors stumped. Sophie watched in awe as he moved through the rounds, his brilliance on full display for the first time in his life. When the final round came, Matthew was in the lead. His competitors, though talented, couldn't keep up with his quick thinking and analytical mind. Sophie held her breath, her eyes fixed on her son as he took the final test, a challenging problem that required not just knowledge, but creativity and innovation. Matthew worked quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sophie could see the gears turning in his mind, and in that moment, she knew he was going to succeed. And then, with a final flourish, Matthew finished the problem. The room fell silent as the judges reviewed his answer. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as the seconds ticked by, and then, "Matthew Carter," the judge called, his voice filled with admiration. "First place." The crowd erupted into applause, but all Sophie could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She looked at Alexander, who was smiling with unrestrained pride. For a moment, everything seemed to stop, and Sophie realized that this was the moment that would define their family's future. Matthew, in his quiet way, had proven something not just to the world, but to himself. He was capable of greatness, and so was she. As they left the competition, Matthew's first-place trophy in hand, Sophie felt a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't known in years. It was as if the universe had given them a sign, a validation of everything they had fought for. And as they walked through the city streets, their small family united, Sophie couldn't help but feel that the future was wide open for them. But it wasn't just Matthew's triumph that would change everything. It was Alexander's transformation. The man who had once been focused solely on power and wealth was now standing beside them, not as a businessman, but as a father, proud, humble, and changed. He had found something far more valuable than anything his family could offer. That evening, as they sat together in the cafe, the soft light of the evening sun casting a warm glow over the room, Alexander turned to Sophie. "I've been thinking a lot about Matthew," he said quietly. "Watching him today, I realized that he's everything I never had growing up. He's strong, intelligent, and most of all, he's kind." Sophie smiled softly, her heart swelling with love for both of them. "I've always known how special he is." Alexander reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "He's our future, Sophie, and I'm so grateful that he's a part of mine now." For a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands intertwined. In that quiet moment, Sophie realized that their journey, Matthew's journey, had only just begun. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, she felt certain that they were ready for whatever the future held. Because together, they had already begun to build something incredible, a life filled with love, possibility, and the promise of more triumphs to come. The months that followed Matthew's victory were a blur of joy and newfound hope. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to offer them a second chance, a chance to redefine what their family could be. For Sophie and Alexander, the road ahead was still uncertain, but they were walking it together, their steps more assured with each passing day. The cafe, once a small, humble gathering place, had become a cornerstone of the community. What had started as Sophie's labor of love now thrived with the support of both familiar faces and newcomers who were drawn in by its warmth. Alexander, ever diligent and ready to prove himself, had thrown himself into the cafe's growth. He wasn't just the wealthy heir to Gray Enterprises anymore. He was a partner to Sophie, a man who now understood the value of hard work, of dedication to something meaningful. He helped design a new menu, oversaw renovations to the space, and made sure to connect with customers in a way that made them feel like family. But it wasn't just about business. The cafe became a place where their family found moments of peace and togetherness. Even Matthew, once so reserved, had grown more comfortable in his skin, stepping into his new role as a young boy whose talents were now celebrated, not hidden away. One sunny afternoon, as the cafe hummed with the sounds of chatter and clinking cups, Sophie leaned against the counter, watching Alexander and Matthew interact with a group of regulars. The warmth in their smiles, the ease with which they conversed. It was as if they had been this way all along, as if the years of tension and heartache were nothing but distant memories. Sophie couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. It had been a difficult journey, filled with moments of doubt, pain, and fear. But here, in the soft glow of the afternoon light, they had found their rhythm. They had become a family, not one bound by blood or status, but by love, trust, and shared dreams. "Do you ever think about how much things have changed?" Sophie asked Alexander, her voice soft but filled with wonder. Alexander, who had just finished speaking with a couple seated at a nearby table, looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he replied. "I've never been more grateful for anything in my life." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling. "I never imagined we'd end up here, you know? I thought I was doing okay on my own, but with you and Matthew, it's like my world has expanded. I never realized how much more there could be." Alexander's gaze softened as he moved closer to her, his hand gently brushing hers. "I never knew how empty my life was until I found you and Matthew. I had everything the world could offer, money, power, status, but none of it mattered. What we have, this family, is worth more than all of that combined." Sophie felt a surge of emotion, and for a moment, she simply stood there, lost in the depth of his words. It was true. They had both come from very different worlds, but in this small, cozy cafe, they had found a bond that transcended everything that had once divided them. As they stood together, Matthew walked up to them, holding a book in his hands. "Mom, Alexander, I finished the puzzle," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. Sophie crouched down to meet him, her heart overflowing with pride. "That's amazing, Matthew. I knew you could do it." Matthew smiled shyly, his hand twisting the book in his grip. I was thinking maybe we could do something fun this weekend. A family outing, like we talked about before. Maybe go to the park or the zoo." Sophie's heart swelled at the thought. They hadn't had a family outing in a long time. Life had been so busy, so focused on getting things right that they hadn't taken the time to simply enjoy each other's company. But Matthew's suggestion was the reminder they both needed. "I'd love that," Alexander said, his voice filled with warmth. "How about we make a day of it? We can pack a picnic, spend the whole day out there." Sophie smiled at the thought. "It's a deal. A day for just the three of us." The idea of spending the day as a family, free from the pressures of the cafe, the past, or the looming shadows of Alexander's old life, felt like the perfect gift. And as the weekend approached, they made plans to turn Matthew's simple suggestion into a beautiful day of bonding, something they all needed. The day of their outing was bright and clear, the sun casting a golden glow over the city as they packed their things and headed out. They chose a small park on the outskirts of the city, a quiet spot filled with lush green trees and wide open spaces. It was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of their everyday lives and just be together. They arrived early in the morning, just as the park was starting to wake up. The air was crisp and the grass, still dewy with the morning's mist, sparkled in the sunlight. They set up a picnic blanket beneath a large oak tree, the shade providing a cool reprieve from the heat of the sun. Matthew immediately ran off to explore, his energy boundless as he darted from one spot to another. Sophie and Alexander watched him, their eyes filled with affection. For a moment, they were just parents. No titles, no expectations. There was no cafe to manage, no business empire to run, no family legacy to uphold. It was just them, enjoying each other's company in a way that felt natural and effortless. As the day wore on, they shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. They played games, had a picnic lunch, and took turns pushing Matthew on the swing. It was a simple day, but for Sophie and Alexander, it felt like everything they had been working toward. A life they could build, not just for themselves, but for Matthew as well. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sophie looked over at Alexander. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked quietly. Alexander, who had been watching Matthew chase a butterfly in the distance, turned to her. "I think about it all the time, but I don't worry anymore. I know that no matter what happens, we're in this together." Sophie smiled, her heart full. "I used to think that having everything meant having more. But now I know that the real wealth is in moments like this, simple, real, and filled with love." Alexander reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "I couldn't agree more." As they sat together, watching the last light of the day fade, Sophie realized that they had come a long way. They had faced their fears, their pasts, and the uncertainty of the future. And yet, here they were, a family, stronger than ever, ready to embrace whatever came next. They didn't need to know what the future held. They had each other, and that was enough. The days that followed their perfect family outing were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Sophie, Alexander, and Matthew had tasted the sweetness of a life unburdened by the weight of the past, but they knew that the future would not always be free of challenges. The shadows of Alexander's previous life still lingered, and for all the progress they had made as a family, there was one thing that remained unsettled: the specter of Alexander's financial troubles. It had been months since Matthew's victory at the competition, a win that had, in many ways, changed their lives. But Alexander had never fully opened up to Sophie about the depth of his personal and business struggles. The facade of success he had built for so long was crumbling, and while he had worked tirelessly at the cafe and poured his energy into supporting Sophie, there were times when the stress and weight of his past decisions caught up with him. One evening, after the cafe had closed and Matthew had gone to bed, Alexander sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring into the dim light of the lamp. Sophie had noticed his silence all evening, the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed heavier. She had tried to give him space, but she couldn't ignore the worry in her chest any longer. She walked into the kitchen and sat across from him, her hands clasped in front of her. "What's wrong, Alexander?" she asked gently, her voice a soft invitation to open up. For a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes seemed lost in thought, as if he were searching for the right words. Then, with a heavy sigh, he finally spoke. "I've been holding back, Sophie," he began, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "I haven't been honest with you about everything, about what's really going on with my business, with my family, and the mess I've made of it all." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always known there was more to Alexander's story than he let on, but hearing him admit it out loud left her both anxious and curious. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently in a silent show of support. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Alexander took a deep breath, his hand tightening around hers as if drawing strength from her touch. "I've made some bad decisions. I've ignored the warning signs, pushed people away, and now, my family's business is on the brink of collapse. The company's in debt, and my father, he's furious with me for letting it all fall apart. He's threatened to disown me." Sophie felt a sharp pang of empathy for him. She had seen Alexander change. He had worked so hard to shed the person he once was, to leave behind the world of cold business transactions and power struggles. But the scars of that past were still there, lurking beneath the surface. "I didn't want to bring this to you," Alexander continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want you to see me as someone who couldn't fix his own mess. But I'm scared, Sophie. I don't know how to turn it all around, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to give you the life you deserve." Sophie leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "Alexander, you've already given me everything I could ever ask for. You've shown me that change is possible, that love and hard work can build something beautiful. You've already turned your life around in ways that matter. ways that go far beyond money or status. She paused, her words sinking in as she looked at him with unwavering determination. We'll figure this out. Together. No matter what happens, I believe in you. And I believe in us. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Sophie wasn't sure if Alexander believed her. But then, slowly, he nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. You don't know how much that means to me. Over the next few days, Sophie and Alexander began to take action. Alexander reached out to the advisors and accountants who had been working behind the scenes to try and salvage the failing business. The road ahead was going to be difficult. There were cuts to be made, debts to be paid, and decisions that could make or break the future of the company. But Alexander was determined to do it with integrity. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could take responsibility. He could make amends, not just for his sake, but for the future he wanted to build with Sophie and Matthew. He made the difficult decision to step away from his position at Gray Enterprises, choosing instead to restructure the business with honesty and transparency. The company would survive, but it would have to evolve. The ruthless tactics of the past would be replaced with a focus on sustainable growth and a stronger sense of community. Sophie stood by his side through it all, offering him a steady hand as they navigated the storm together. She knew the process wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments when they both questioned whether they were doing the right thing. But she also knew that this was the only path forward, a path built on honesty, hard work, and trust. And then there was Matthew. Matthew, who had quietly watched the changes unfolding around him, had begun to take on more responsibility in the cafe. At first, he had just helped with small tasks, wiping down tables, delivering orders to customers, and sitting quietly at the counter as Sophie and Alexander handled the more complex tasks. But as the cafe became busier and the future more uncertain, Matthew found himself stepping into a more active role. One afternoon, as Sophie worked behind the counter, Matthew walked up to her with a determined look in his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "I want to help more. I think I can take on more responsibility. I know I'm young, but I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think I can help make a difference." Sophie smiled warmly at him, pride swelling in her chest. "You've already helped more than you know, Matthew. You've been a steady hand in all of this." Matthew's eyes lit up, and for the first time in a long while, Sophie saw a sense of confidence in him that mirrored the growth she had seen in Alexander. Together, they were building something truly remarkable. A family united not just by love, but by shared dreams, hard work, and the promise of a future where they could all thrive. And so, as they continued to face the challenges of the present, Sophie knew that the foundation they had built would be enough. The past was a shadow they would never fully escape, but it no longer had the power to control them. They had learned to overcome it, to rise above the mistakes of the past, and to embrace the future with open hearts. For Sophie, Alexander, and Matthew, the journey was just beginning. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together as a family, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. The morning air was crisp and fresh, the sun casting a golden hue across the streets of Queens as Sophie and Alexander stood outside the cafe, surveying the scene. It had been several months since they had begun their journey of transformation, both in their personal lives and in the cafe itself. The business, once teetering on the edge of collapse, had now found new life, thanks to their unwavering commitment and tireless work. The customers who had once been mere passers-by had become familiar faces, returning not just for the food and coffee, but for the warmth and camaraderie that filled the cafe. Today, however, was special. Today was the day of the grand reopening. The cafe was more than just a business now. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome and built together. The new menu was ready. The freshly renovated space gleamed with an inviting glow, and the energy in the air was contagious. Sophie couldn't help but smile, feeling the weight of the past slowly lifting as she looked at the life they had created. "Are you ready for today?" Alexander asked, his voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Sophie glanced over at him, her heart swelling with pride. There was a time when she never would have imagined Alexander standing here, beside her, not just as a partner in business, but as a partner in life. His transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. He had let go of the reins of his family's business empire to embrace something real, something tangible. And in doing so, he had rediscovered himself. "I'm ready," Sophie said, her voice firm with conviction. "And I know it's going to be amazing." As they stepped inside, Matthew greeted them with a beaming smile, his energy radiating through the room. The transformation in him was just as profound. Gone was the shy, introverted boy who had once kept to the sidelines. Matthew had grown into someone confident, someone who was no longer afraid to step into the spotlight. He had taken on a leadership role at the cafe, helping with everything from managing the daily operations to brainstorming new ideas for the menu. His passion for the business had been infectious, and it had only strengthened the bond between them all. "Mom, Alexander, it's almost time," Matthew called, his eyes bright with excitement. "The first customers are here, and they're already lining up." Sophie couldn't help but chuckle at his enthusiasm. She moved toward him, wrapping him in a quick hug. "You've done an amazing job, Matthew. We couldn't have come this far without you." Matthew grinned, but there was a humility in his expression. "We all did it together," he said simply. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The cafe was packed with customers, some familiar, others new, all eager to see the changes that had taken place. Laughter and conversation filled the air as the trio worked seamlessly together, greeting customers, delivering orders, and making sure everything ran smoothly. The cafe was no longer just a business. It was a place where memories were made, where people came not just to get their caffeine fix, but to feel part of something bigger. For Sophie and Alexander, the joy of watching their dream unfold was indescribable. Every time they looked around the room, they saw the fruits of their labor, of the love, dedication, and sweat they had poured into this venture. But it wasn't just the cafe that had transformed. They had both changed in ways they never could have predicted. Sophie had found her strength in ways she had never imagined. She had stepped into her role not only as the owner of a thriving cafe, but as a woman who had built a life she was proud of. She had come to understand that success wasn't just about financial gain. It was about the connections made, the lives touched, and the moments that defined what truly mattered. And Alexander had come into his own. He had given up the weight of his family's legacy to embrace something more meaningful. He no longer chased the approval of a distant father or the hollow validation of business success. He had found fulfillment in the simple, yet profound, act of living a life grounded in love, humility, and integrity. As the day drew to a close, the cafe gradually began to empty, the last few customers trickling out with satisfied smiles and promises to return. The soft glow of the lights reflected the peaceful calm that settled over the room. Sophie, Alexander, and Matthew stood behind the counter, taking a moment to appreciate the success of the day. "This is it, isn't it?" Sophie said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "This is what we've worked for." Alexander nodded, his gaze full of emotion. "Yes, this is the life I always dreamed of, but I never knew it until I found you in Matthew." Sophie reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "It's not just a dream anymore. It's our reality." Matthew stepped forward, his face lit up with the same pride that his parents shared. "We did it together, as a family." And in that moment, standing in the cafe they had built together, Sophie realized that the journey had been worth every struggle, every sacrifice. The road had been long, and at times, uncertain. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of questioning whether they were on the right path. But looking at her family, at the love, trust, and hope they had cultivated, Sophie knew with certainty that this was the life she had always wanted. Their story wasn't about wealth or status, but about resilience. It wasn't about a perfect, easy journey, but about facing adversity and overcoming it together. As they stood there, their hands joined. Looking around at the cafe they had created, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but they were no longer afraid. They had everything they needed, each other, and as the lights in the cafe dimmed, they stepped outside into the cool night air, knowing that they were ready for whatever came next. Their future was no longer defined by the shadows of the past. It was defined by the love they had built and the family they had created. Together, They had found their new beginning, and nothing could take that away from them. Years passed, and the small cafe on the corner of Queens continued to thrive. It was no longer just a business. It was a testament to the strength, resilience, and love that had been poured into it. Sophie, Alexander, and Matthew had created a life that was far from perfect, but it was perfectly theirs. Sophie had long since shed the weight of her past fears, becoming not only a beloved business owner, but a woman who had found her true calling. Her cafe had grown into a sanctuary for the community, a place where people came to share stories, laughter, and warmth. She had built something that went beyond food and drink. It was a place where hearts connected and lives were touched. Alexander had never returned to the corporate world he once ruled. Instead, he dedicated himself to the cafe, working alongside Sophie and Matthew every day. The man who had once sought validation through power and wealth now found his worth in the small, meaningful moments of everyday life. He had learned that true success wasn't measured by the size of one's bank account, but by the love one could give and receive. Matthew, now a young man with the world at his feet, had grown into a leader in his own right. The boy who once watched from the sidelines had become a key figure in the cafe, managing the operations with the wisdom of someone far beyond his years. His intelligence, combined with the love and guidance from his parents, had molded him into someone who was ready to face any challenge with strength and conviction. Together, they had built a family, not just by blood, but by choice. Through trials, mistakes, and victories, they had created a foundation stronger than anything wealth or status could ever offer. Their bond was their greatest achievement. As the sun set on another perfect evening, Sophie and Alexander stood outside the cafe, watching as the lights flickered on in the windows, casting a warm glow into the street. Matthew, now grown, walked over to join them, his arms open in a welcoming gesture. "We did it," Alexander said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Sophie smiled, her heart full of love. "Yes, we did." And as they stood together, watching the world go by, they knew that no matter where life would take them, they would face it as a family. Their future, built on love, resilience, and second chances, was just beginning, and they were ready for whatever came next. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the entire story. I truly appreciate your support and for joining me on this incredible journey of love, growth, and second chances. I hope you enjoyed every moment as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on any future content. Your support means the world, and it helps me continue creating more stories that I hope will inspire and entertain you. Thank you once again for being here. Let's keep growing together. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.